is if there's absolutely nothing on the film, or if you're using a digital camera, if the file is so overexposed that you can't see anything, or if there's highlights that are completely white, or if you measure them with the info palette and they read 255, 255, 255, there's nothing you can do. I mean, you can fake information, you might be able to fake in a little bit of tone, but if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. So you want to have something to work with. Now this file is about 1.5 to 2 stops overexposed. It's too light. So let's see what Photoshop can do to kick back a little bit of the density. I'm going to go into full screen mode, and once again I'm going to add an adjustment layer. Now you'll notice I'm always using levels and curves, levels and curves. We'll be talking about color balance and hue saturation once we get into the color section. Now, when you're using this technique, levels or curves, remember, just click OK. It doesn't matter if you added a levels adjustment layer or a curves adjustment layer. They're going to work the same way. Work with whatever you're comfortable with. So, this image is too light. So what am I going to do? Too light, I immediately think multiply. And boom, look at this. This is amazing how with one click I went from that to that much density. Okay, so I can actually rescue this image pretty well. Now, the way I am, if I like a change, I always want more of it. So what I always do is if I like something, like, ooh, I want to see what is this file going to look like with more correction. Well, there is no more button in Photoshop, but what more is just double that adjustment layer by duplicating it. Meaning I'm going to grab the icon and drag it down to the new layer icon, and that doubles it. Now, in this instance, that image got too dark, but because I'm working on adjustment layer, you can still control the density with opacity. So look what happens. I can just back off. So now I have 135% correction. Where did I get that figure? This curve is being multiplied at 100% opacity. Then I added another curve and I set it to 35. So I now have a density change of 135%, which is really, really amazing. Especially, let me just turn these adjustment layers off for a moment. I went from that to that in a few seconds. So by using adjustment layers in combination with the blending modes, you can salvage images which you really thought were hopeless. Now when you're doing a lot of restoration and retouching, what happens a lot of times is you'll be working with files that were either taken at the same time or stored in the same way, and that means you'll have 2, 4, 100 images that have the same problem. Now, it can get very, very tedious to do the same color correction or tonal correction over and over and over again. What you can do, though, is if you've set the color or tonal correction on one file, you can share that correction with all the other files that have a similar problem. Now, I have an example like that right here on the monitor where I was shooting here in the Black Forest, and the weather was always gray and rainy. So I have like 2 rolls of film where all the pictures are a little too dark and a little too flat. So what I want to do is make these statues pop, but I want to apply that change to all the files, and I don't want it to be a lot of work. So if you ever run into a problem like that, try this technique. What you do is you open up one representative image that has the problems that you're trying to fix. So I'll start with this statue picture. It's a little flat, it's a little dark, and I'm going to use the adjustment layers. So let's go into curves, and you know me, I'm going to try to be a lazy Photoshopper first. So let's see if screen will pop it right up, and it did, but it also actually made it a little too bright. So I can actually just, back off on the opacity. And even though I am working with screen, you can still double click on the interface and let's say drop down the shadows a little bit and boost up the highlights here. This is your classic S-curve. They'll always add a little contrast to a file. So there's the file, and I like it this way. See, if I turn the adjustment layer on and off, you can see what kind of change there is. But now, look what I have here. I have 3 other files at differing resolutions. So let's see how that correction looks on this file. What you want to do is get your Move tool from the tool palette, come over to the Layers palette, and literally just grab the icon and drag it over to the next file, and you're done. Photoshop applied that exact same correction to the next file. Here, check out the Layers palette. It took the adjustment layer, it took the screen blending mode, and it even took the opacity setting I had made. What's even better than that, this is a very small file. It's only a 326K file. Sitting right back here is the same scan, but in full resolution. It's a 6 megabyte file. What I can do is I can make the adjustment on a low resolution scan, get the Move tool and just drag over that file, and image adjustment layers are resolution independent, meaning I can do the correction on small files. Let's say I've got a lot to correct, or I want a slower machine, and I get to a fast machine, I'll just drag over that correction, and Photoshop fills the entire layer with that correction. And here's another high-res file taken at the same time. Just take my layer, drag it over, done. So whenever you have files that have the same problem, be it with tone or color, get one file right the way you like it, and then just use your Move tool and drag that adjustment layer over to all the files with similar problems, and your work will be done in no time at all. Many times your images will have an overall problem, a global problem, but lots of times you'll have a problem only in a specific area. For example, in this image, the bottom of the image is much too dark. So we're going to use image adjustment layers in combination with blending modes and masking to salvage just the bottom part of that image. So I look at this picture, I think dark, I'm thinking screen. So I'm going to add an adjustment layer, drop down the levels, and click OK. Don't do anything. I know that feels really odd, but just trust me, don't do anything. Remember screen, go back up to screen. Now look at the difference. Here's the bottom of the picture, and look how it's starting to come up. I can actually start seeing houses and the trees, etc. But the sky is getting completely blown out. Uh-oh. Well, it's not just an either-or proposition. I can use the mask that Photoshop 6 automatically adds to the adjustment layer to hide my change from the sky and let it be active on the bottom part of the image. Now right here is the mask. This is the icon for the levels, and this is the mask. And you can see that it's completely white. Well, that makes sense because when you're masking an image, everywhere the mask is white, it's active. Photoshop lets the effect show through. If I add black to this mask, I can hide the effect. Let me just take a really big paintbrush, and I'm just going to paint with black right up here in the sky. And what you're seeing is the dark part of that sky showing back through. See that dark spot? Well, that's exactly what I just did with that mask. Now I don't want to have to paint that sky out. I'm going to use an even bigger brush. And in this case, I want to create a blended mask. The biggest brush Photoshop has is actually your gradient tool. And what the gradient tool does, it lets you paint over the entire file at once. So I'm going to use a standard black to white gradient. And what you see in the middle of the picture, I have this tiny little crosshair. That's where Photoshop, from that point on up, is going to be pure black. Then I click and hold the mouse. There's a very thin line. That's my transition. And the second crosshair is going to go to white. And that means the tonal correction will show through. And look at that. That is amazing. Well, I think it's amazing. I've been doing this stuff for years and I'm still excited about it. So look at this. And you can keep trying the blend until you get the blend exactly the way you like it. All right, so I just keep trying it, and you don't even have to undo it. You just keep working over it. And now look at the mask. Remember, wherever there's black, Photoshop won't let that change show through. Where there's white, it's active. So in case you ever get mixed up about, what is black doing, what is white doing, there's this little trick that I remember, and it's called black protects and white affects. So black is protecting, that means the sky is not getting lightened up. Now, like I did before, I really like this change and I want more of it. I want to lighten the bottom up even more. So once again, I'm going to duplicate this adjustment layer by dragging down the new layer icon, and the image is getting too light now. So once again, I'll just back off to, as I would say, back off till you like the image to taste. And now look at that difference, very subtle, that I've lightened up that bottom part even a little bit more. And best of all, Photoshop took that mask along with me, so you don't have to redraw it. So in this instance, I needed to lighten up the bottom part of the image. So added an image adjustment layer of levels, just click OK, don't do anything, change that blending mode to screen so you can see the problem part of the image lighten up. And then use your gradient mask tool, your gradient blend tool, to draw a blend on that image to hide the effect from where you don't want it affected. And if anybody that's done any kind of landscape photography can really see what's going on here, that I'm using a neutral density on the sky to keep that exposure down. There's lots of times where you're going to take a picture in not the best light, or the light's too contrasty or too harsh. You can use Photoshop to selectively open up shadows and cut down on the lighting ratios or the lighting contrast. That's something we're going to do with this picture because these shadows are much too dark for this file. What you want to actually avoid is actually taking pictures in the middle of the day like this, because you see how harsh that shadow is and how hard it is, and it's really, really contrasty. And I couldn't wait for the light to get better. I mean, I was traveling, take the picture, go. What I want to do is just open up the shadows of this file. Okay, so I just want to open up the shadows. So that means I need to select the shadows. Now, I know everybody's favorite selection tool is the magic wand, but if it starts with the word magic, I am very suspect of it. But I'll show you how that works. If I click over here and I click, it's like, okay, this is great. And I keep clicking, and then all of a sudden I start getting very tired. Because see what's going to happen? I'd have to actually hold down my shift key and click inside of every one of these little holes. My rule of thumb is if you have to use 3 clicks to make a selection, you're doing something wrong. So I'm going to drop that selection. And now let's use the Smart Magic Wand, which is not on your toolbar. It's under your Select menu. In fact, here it is. It's Color Range. And what Color Range lets you do is, yes, it lets you sample colors, but when you're working with tone, check this out. I'm going to drop right down to shadows, and look at that. It just selected all the shadows for me without any work with 1 click. I'm going to say OK. So now I have all the shadows selected. Whenever you have an active selection and you add an adjustment layer, and I'll go down to curves, and once again, I'm going to be a lazy Photoshopper. I'm going to say OK. But look what Photoshop did. In my layers palette, it took that selection and transferred it to the layer mask. So wherever you see white, my effect is going to show through, which this makes perfect sense because I had the shadow selected. And now I'm going to drop down to screen. Remember, I want to lighten up. And let's zoom in a little bit. And look at what's happening. I'm going to turn that on and off. Look at how those shadows just open up beautifully. And none of the other parts of the pictures are getting affected. So when I saw this, I was like, that's great. My work is done. And then I took a closer look at that file. Now let's zoom in a little bit. Uh-oh. You see what's going on here? There seem to be like tears and rips. Like here on his arm, it goes from dark to an ugly line to the highlight. Same thing on his stomach. We've got these like tears, almost looks like tie-dye. That's a problem. Now, whenever you try to fix something in Photoshop, what you want to do is identify what's causing the problem. Well, the problem, is it the adjustment layer? Not really. The problem is being caused by the mask. And let me show you what that looks like. If you want to just see the mask by itself, you can on the Mac Option click or on the PC Alt click right on the mask, and Photoshop will show you that mask in black and white. And this is what's causing the problem. There's that line. There's the transition. Here are those odd marks in his stomach. The problem is the color range shadow selection was too either or. You're either a shadow or you're not. And what happened is all the nice transitions of tone were ignored. So what we want to do is soften this mask and add that transition back. So I'm going to Option Alt click again on this mask because I can have the mask active. There's a tiny little line around it, and I can still see the effect of my next move of I need to soften this mask. To soften the mask, I'm going to go under the Filter menu and go Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And what you want to do is I can click right here, and you want to use a setting depending on your file and your file size and the effect that you want. I usually use between 1 to 3. And look what happens. If I click over here, if I click the mouse button down on the interface here, that's before, that's after, before and after. So you can see this mask is getting softened up. I'll go a little bit higher. You don't want to go too high, things will get too mushy. And now look, there's a beautiful transition starting to happen. I'm going to click OK. And I want you to watch this area right here as I undo that, just so you can see what I just did. So the Control or Command Z, that's before. See how harsh that transition is? And that's after. So you can start with initial selection. And once you add an adjustment layer, Photoshop will transfer that selection information into the mask, which is great. And then if need be, you want to go back and rework that mask. Normally you would use the blur filters or also some of the blur tools. You can even use some of the painting tools, black and white, which I'll show in a moment, in order to control those transitions very, very nicely. So here's the image before, and there's after. I can see information in my shadows, but I don't get any of that tearing, which is very, very important. When you're taking pictures, of course, it's always better to get the light right while you're taking the picture. But lots of times in the rush or in the excitement, you just forget to either turn on the flash or set the right exposure. We can use Photoshop to selectively lighten up very specific areas of the picture. For example, with this picture, we're going to lighten up just her face and leave the rest of the image the way it is. So this is my original, and let me show you where I'm going to be going with this. I'm going to go to that to just lighten up that face. So this is how this is done. I'm going to start with the original image, and I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer. Now, this is going to look a little odd. I'm going to lighten that image up, and you can see the entire image is getting lightened up, which is a real shame because the background starts popping, and we've got this figure here, and the dress is getting too light. But what you want to do when you use this following technique is just look at the part of the image that you're interested in. So I'm just watching her face, and I don't care about anything else. So there, that's how light I'm going to want the face. I'm going to click OK. Now you can see the image is way too light. The dress is getting blown out. This little guy in the background is just jumping out at me. But once again, we're going to use that mask. Now remember, that mask is white, so it's completely active. What I need to do is turn this mask off, fill it with black. And the easiest way to do that is to go Image, Adjust, Invert. Or what I do, obviously, I use the Command key. I would go Command I, and watch the mask when that happens. What's going to happen is the mask turned completely black, which turned off the entire adjustment. So even if I turn it on and off, you don't see a change. But this is going to be my canvas that I can paint on. So what I'll do is I'll set my foreground color to white and get a large, soft airbrush. I can come up to the brushes palette, choose a large, soft airbrush. And I like working with a low opacity. I'm going to go down to about 15%. because I'd rather start with a low opacity and build up the lightening effect than try to get it right at one time. So let me just paint over her face with white on the mask. And look at that. It's like I'm lightening up just the areas I'm interested in. So I'm going to lighten up her face, maybe a little bit in the hair. If I wanted to, I could actually lighten up parts of the dress too. But I'm going to concentrate on her face. Now I'm going to keep going over it until I get the effect that I want. And the greatest thing about this technique is, because I used a large soft airbrush, you don't see any edge artifacts. I'm going to turn this adjustment layer off. Look at that. That's how dark the original was. And that's what I just painted back in. It's as if somebody was there with like a fill card, a little bit of flash, and just lighten that face right up. Now, you can use this technique on portraits, but also if you do any type of still life photography and you want to bring a little bit more light onto a certain product, add an adjustment layer, lighten up the scene, fill the mask with black, and then just paint back along that product, around the edges, maybe the label, and just lighten it up slightly. And what will happen is our eyes are attracted to light areas. And that way you can control where the viewer's eyes look. They like light, we don't like looking at dark. And that way you can make sure the person's looking where you want them to look. In the following exercise, we'll use Photoshop to accentuate the natural light which is in the picture by darkening the darks and lightening the lights. But also we're going to add a hint of light by working with a neutral layer set to overlay to add a little bit of light into exactly where we want the viewer's eye to go. You've got the lone tree being hit by a little bit of light on a quasi-stormy day. But this photo is really flat. Now it's still an exposure and a contrast problem. I want to show you this great little technique that I've developed that I use when I have photos like this that just need a little bit of snap and a little bit of light. So what I'm going to show is this is the original, and I'm going to go to this photo, make it much, much more dramatic. All right? And the best part about this technique is it's really easy. So there's my original photo, and I'll quickly just flatten all these files, throw all those files away. Now, if you have a color photo like this that needs a little bit of pop, you could use levels, you could use curves too, but try this technique on the next time you have a photo that needs a little bit of snap. What we want to do is load the image luminosity of the file. And on the Mac, to do that, you hold down the Command and the Option key and tap tilde. And you can get this very, very odd selection. On the PC, it would be Control-Alt-tilde. Now, I've heard some people, if they have a keyboard like a French keyboard, there might not be a tilde there. So what you can do to get this exact same effect is come over to your Channels palette, hold down the Command on the Mac or the Control, and click on the icon of the RGB file. Okay? I prefer using the keyboard command, but that's how you can do that too. Now, it might be a little frustrating. Don't try looking through the menu. Where is that in the menu? It's not in the menu anywhere. This is one of those command keys which isn't in a menu, so you just have to remember, on a Mac, Command, Option, tilde, on a PC, Control-Alt-tilde. Now, what I have here is the average luminance of the image. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy-paste that onto its own layer, right? Just by going Layer, New, Layer via Copy. Or you can see right here, there's my Command key that I learned very quickly, Command or Control-J. And what you have now is this very odd, faint tracing of the image. But remember, we're dealing with a tone, a little bit of exposure and a contrast issue here. Think blending modes. What can Photoshop do to help me? Well, let me try overlay. Now that's pretty good. Let me see what soft light will do. Got a little softer, and hard light. In this case, overlay and hard light gave me the exact same results, but I really like them. Look, I'm going to turn this off, and the image is flat. Turn it right back on, that image just pops right up. Now, knowing me, if I like it, I want it more, so I'm going to duplicate this layer again And that image is really popping now. Now, I might be happy with this, but I want to accentuate that lightness and darkness even more. I want to darken down that sky and also have a little bit of ray of light coming in and hitting that tree. One thing you might have noticed that when I'm working is I never work on that background layer. I always keep the background layer as if it was the day I scanned it, all right? Now I want to add light or dark, so I need to add a new type of layer that we use for lightening and darkening images, which is called a neutral layer. In Photoshop, you have 3 neutral colors, and you can probably guess what they are: black, gray, and white. So I've got these 3 neutral colors, and you can use these neutral colors in combination with the blending modes to give yourself layers that you can use for lightening and darkening. Now this is really great. If I click on my new layer icon down here, and I just click on it, I'm not holding anything on the keyboard, you just get an empty layer. And that's very useful for retouching, but I don't want to use that right now. That's just an empty layer. If on the Mac you hold on the Option key, or on the PC the Alt key, and you click on the new layer icon, you get the new layer dialog box. And what this lets you do is it lets you choose a blending mode. When you're working with lightening and darkening, think overlay. Because overlay, remember, overlay lightens the lights and darkens the darks. So I can do lightening and darkening on the same layer. Now look what happened when I selected the overlay blending mode. This dialog box got dark. I'll just go back to normal. See? It's grayed out. Go back to overlay. It's gotten darkened. So I'm going to click OK. And what that's going to do is Photoshop's going to add a layer, set its blending mode to overlay, and fill it with 50% gray, which, as you can see in my layers palette, is completely invisible, which is great because 50% gray is invisible on overlay. So what I have now is a tonal canvas that I can work on to lighten or darken an image. So first I'm going to accentuate the natural landscape here. So I'll reset my foreground and background color palette to black and white by clicking on the little default button. And I get my large soft airbrush. And once again, I'm going to go way down the opacity because you want to be subtle when you're adding light and darkening dark. So I'm just going to follow the natural contours of this landscape. And if I want to lighten an area, I would switch my colors. I can lighten this background. And now let's darken in that sky just a little bit. And what's going to happen is that sky is starting to get a little stormier. Okay? And now, if we want to have like fingers of light coming down, I can come over here with my white airbrush. Now this brush is too large. I could always keep coming back here to my brushes palette and going, oh yeah, I guess I need a 200 pixel brush or a 300 pixel brush. But the problem with that is you can never really see what it's doing in relationship to the image. What I like doing is just keep the brush in the picture and then use your left bracket and your right bracket key. And that's the same on the Mac or the PC. Left bracket, I just tap it and you can see the brush gets smaller. Right bracket, I just tap it and the brush gets larger. So I hardly ever use the brushes palette. I'll just jump right to my left bracket key. Now, you don't have to memorize every single command key in Photoshop. In fact, there's 600 command keys that aren't even in the manual. But what you do want to do is, slowly learn the ones that you're going to use every day. Changing brush size, left bracket, right bracket. We'll talk more about accessing the tools. If I want to use a brush, I just need to tap the B key on my toolbar. If I want to use rubber stamp, it's S. The airbrush, you would think it's A, it's not, it's J. Don't ask. So let me come back here and I'm working with white. I have a very low opacity of 5% white. And I'm going to start outside of the picture, hold down my Shift key, hold down the Shift key and just click down to where that branch is. And let me undo that. See that difference? That's just a little bit of lightening. Can add a little bit more. Now, if you don't want to get this dramatic with this file, that's fine. I'm playing around with it. I wanted to create sort of like a voice from the heavens. And I would say in those few moments that I used to make this picture pop, it's been pretty successful. So once again, here's the original file. Flat, boring, dull. By using the image luminosity, remember, select the luminosity, put it on its own layer, and change that blend mode to hard light. Make that image pop. Wanted some more. And the really interesting technique here that I use all the time in landscapes, in product photography, and also in portrait retouching is the ability to add shading, lights and darks, to the image at any point. Now, I like doing this on a separate overlay neutral layer because if I go too far, let's just pretend I go too far here and it's starting to look way overdone. Well, now I can still undo it, but if I did something and do it again, it's like, uh-oh, it's too overdone. I have the choice. I could either throw this layer away completely by putting it in the trash can, or don't forget, it's 50% gray. So you can just come over to your color picker and choose 50% gray, which is 0, 0, and 50% brightness. And I could literally paint right back on that overlay neutral layer and take away any effect that I want. So what I'm doing is actually hiding something that I did too much. So by using layers to build up this correction, you can really influence where those lights and darks fall. So what I want you to do is remember to add a neutral layer and work with the blacks and whites and the grays in order to add dimension to a file. And remember, the human eye will always go to what's lighter. So use that information to draw the viewer's eyes into the part of the picture you really want them to look at. Now, once you've taken care of your tonal or exposure problems with an image, then it's time to really start working with the color. Now, color is a very, very subjective matter. And what you want to do is, always take a moment to look at the image and try to find a similar image, maybe in your memory or in your own stock collection that you can refer to. I mean, because not all the pictures that you work with are going to be pictures that you took yourself. For example,